What's cool about our process is we actually ended up pushing the state of the art in the industry. Most tools will only show you the shortest path because our tools are used to gather evidence, and we actually show you all the paths. And when you have 100 billion edges, you can have trillions of paths. The failure mode with POCs is it's a very complex problem. There are a lot of dimensions. The approach of how you solve the problem is probably the most important thing.
Hi, I'm Brett Gibson, and welcome to High Bin, a new podcast where we do deep dives on the art of problem solving with engineers and technical experts from our community of early stage startups. In today's episode, we're sitting down with Rahul Raina, co-founder of TRM Labs. He started his career as a software engineer working at places like AWS and Bloomberg before he joined McKinsey as a management consultant where he helped build the Digital Team for Generation, a nonprofit focused on reskilling people for the modern workforce. Now as co-founder and CTO of TRM, he leads product and engineering as they pursue their mission to build a safer financial system for billions of people. The details of engineering problems fascinate me, but I'm just as interested in how the best engineers I know think, how they zoom in on which details matter the most, and then use that focus to navigate to elegant solutions. Join me on this journey as we discuss thorny engineering problems with my guests and get into the weeds about how they solve them. Hey, Rahul, thanks a lot for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to this.
It's been a while. I know we were just talking before this that it's been a couple of years since I've been here in person and almost pre-COVID, and it brings back great memories. So happy to be here.
Yeah, we used to come and meet in this office monthly.
That's right. Talk about the users, talk about latest experiments and failures mostly, but it was fun.
I'm really excited to talk about some of the things you've done over the years at TRM. It's one of the more interesting technical products, and so I've always enjoyed our conversations about how it works. People probably heard of TRM, a lot have happened over the years. What is the latest?
Our mission at TRM is to build a safer financial system for billions of people, and we want to continue to advance that mission. And what we're seeing as we sort of look into the future is that the scale of the problem has grown. And we talked about scale in terms of engineering scale, but it's also scale in terms of the ways and the diversity in which people are conducting crime, and the diversity in who's being impacted by the crime, and diversity in who's investigating the crime, right? So it used to be, you have these bespoke agencies who were super sophisticated, but now, your local police department has to worry about seizing crypto or identifying potential fraudulent activity. And so what we're seeing is sort of this shift where the scale of the problem is increasing. And what used to be sort of previously more manual methods that perhaps require more human intelligence, what we're really excited about is bringing forward and automating some of those by applying machine intelligence. And so what we're bringing forward and launching soon is something known as signatures, which programmatically and automatically detects patterns that are suspicious or indicative of illicit, suspicious, or other money laundering-like activities, such that as an investigator, you don't have to manually trace or even have the expertise to apply your own judgment. And instead, you can rely on the machine to kind of sift through the tens, approaching hundreds of billions of edges, correlate them, and identify a structuring pattern. To say, actually, you're looking, it's kind of like, if you ever seen the microscope where you kind of like zoom in, and you're like just in this part, and if you zoom out, you realize, oh my God, like this is a giant fraud ring, right? Now, if you're an investigator, like you're probably looking at 1,000 transactions, like, oh my God, this is massive. But the machine is looking at the 100,000 transactions that are part of the even bigger fraud ring. And because the fact that it's a machine, it can kind of deal with that complexity and scale in a way that a human may not be.
Part of this trend generally that's going on in the world right now, machines just being better at things in ways that are not necessarily intuitive before the fact. Perhaps maybe you can talk a little bit about your background and what brought you originally to this problem.
Yeah, my background wasn't like a straight line that, hey, I was a computer nerd who fell in love with crypto. It kind of started very organically. It started, back in college where I first came across the Bitcoin white paper, and really at the time was a intellectual curiosity. And then sort of graduated, got my first job, and then had some money to actually invest. And then moved out of San Francisco in 2018, and this was sort of, at the time, the peak Bitcoin, and it just hit 20,000, which is now a low, but at the time, and just started to like see a lot of innovation with Ethereum and like smart contracts and NFTs and stable coins and Compound and some of these like decentralized DeFi protocols, and really started to shift and say, wow, like there's something going on here. When I moved out of San Francisco, I knew that I wanted to start a company. I didn't know what or with whom at the time, but I did know that great enduring companies are built by riding waves, but not all waves are the same. You kind of catch the right wave, and you have to catch it at the right time. And you'd rather catch it a little early than catch it late, right? Just look at all the great companies that are still around. They sort of are riding either Moore's Law, mobile phones, internet connectivity. They're riding some of these waves, and they kind of gotten pretty early. And so we looked at digital assets and crypto and blockchains, and we're like, this has the potential to fundamentally change the way the world works, because it fundamentally changes the cost structure of commerce, right? So you took something that would cost 2% plus 30 cents per transaction, and you can do it across the world in less than 10 minutes for pennies on the dollar. And when you have a technology that disrupts the core economics of something so dramatically, it's really not a question of if it will become a thing. It's really a question of when it will become a thing. And so we saw this wave come in. I personally have been following it and really sort of seeing all this innovation and then having this realization on the economics, the fundamental economics that's changing. We knew that it was going to be, this is a wave we want to ride. And we said we want to come a little bit early because we have a chance to sort of shape it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we've been playing out over the past 5 years.
Oh, awesome. Maybe you can set the stage about what's hard about building TRM. I think on the one hand, most of the blockchains you're analyzing the data is open, right?
Yeah.
Which is the positive, perhaps the easy part. But on the other hand, it's an obscene amount of data. So
I think there are so many layers of complexity. I think there's a saying that like any sufficiently advanced piece of technology is like indifferentiable from magic, right? It kind of looks almost too simple. Yeah. But when you peel the onion, there's so many layers of complexity. I think if I just sort of focus on the technical aspect, our problem is the types of questions we have to answer and the scale of the data we're dealing with. You can think of TRM as basically building Google Maps for crypto. And when you think about a map, right, at the end of the day, getting for all the nerds out there, we're building this directed graph, right? What's interesting is that the main question that people want to ask with TRM is they want to ask the question, where did the money go? We have this simple question we want to ask, the same way like you ask Google Maps, like what's the fastest way from like New York to SF, for example. Well, there are two things that make it hard. One is the nature of the question, and the second is the scale at which we're having to answer this question. So I'll touch on each of those. The question itself for TRM and for our investigators, right? So when we first started this company 5 years ago, investigators kept coming to us saying, we want to understand where the money went. At first glance, why is that a hard question? Well, unlike Google Maps, which is sort of answering the question from like a one-to-one, it's asking so SF to New York, it's asking like a one-to-one question. Right? Find me the shortest path from SF to New York. We know there's like Dijkstra's algorithms, A-star algorithms. It's a E log V kind of algorithm. What we're trying to answer is it's a one-to-many. So we're trying to answer the question, what are all the destinations that the money went from here? Think of it the other way, it's like asking the question, what are all the places in the world I could go to from San Francisco? Yeah. Right? Like that's a much more interesting and a hard question than saying, can I go from San Francisco to New York? And so we had to answer that question. That's all of a sudden becomes like an E times V, like a quadratic kind of problem space. And then on top of that, you add sort of scale, right? So most graph problems have been, in this domain, have been answered at the scale of millions of edges. What we're dealing with in our space, given the advent of sort of programmatic money flows, right? You can basically write a for loop and generate 1 million transactions. Yeah. We're seeing tens of billions of edges. And with some of the newer blockchains, hundreds of billions of edges. And so now you can quickly see how a quadratic problem with an exponentially growing scale, like a couple orders of magnitude higher, can suddenly become really, really hard to answer. And so that's sort of one of the most interesting challenges for us, is sort of how do we answer this question where the money goes at scale.
It's like the product experience guarantees are like a big driver of that, because you could imagine naively just doing the same loop or recursing across all these transactions if you had to, but that wouldn't work in the type of user experience you're trying to drive for people using the product.
100%, right? I could, when we first started, it's kind of what we did. We used to literally have a for loop and iteratively kind of go through this graph, but our experience is it's a web application, right? You type in any sort of actor or address on the blockchain and you immediately want to understand the fund movement. So that's like the latency challenge. And then there's also the question of cost, right? So we're running a business. So how do we do this, in a cost-effective manner? And the third element of this is how do we do it in a manner that addresses not just the question, because then you have a lot of follow-on questions. People want to sort and filter and all these different sort of user interface things. Like, it's not just I want the question, I want to drill down into that question.
Yeah. It can't be intuitive to the user how much data is actually behind the scenes.
That's right.
They just need the answer.
They just need the answer. We kind of had to invent a new way of solving this problem in a way that met the sort of latency requirements for our customer, the cost requirements for ourselves as a company, and then the data freshness requirements. You have to remember that this graph is constantly updating. It's not a static, a lot of people can do a one-time analysis, right? But two things are changing about our graph. It's like kind of the equivalent of the Earth constantly expanding, new roads being laid out all the time, and new points of interest being tagged, and some points of interest that we thought were previously unknown becoming tagged in the future. So not only are you finding new things in the future, but you're also learning about old things in the past. And so all the shortcuts that you can take when you're traditionally solving such problems, like partitioning. Well, how do you partition a graph? Well, finding an edge cut or a vertex cut in and of itself is an algorithmically complex problem. And then the naive answer of let's just partition by time is not really something that meets our customer experience, because when you're working, for the FBI, you don't care whether it happened today or 10 years ago. You want the experience to be the same, right? So what do people do when you deal with data? They'll say, we'll show you the last 90 days. Or we'll roll up the data.
But that even calls back to the carving up the graph problem, because there's data points that are relevant back in time, even for newer events, right?
100%, right? And we see that even some of the cases that got solved, right? We had the famous Bitfinex hackers, these parked funds that stay dormant for years suddenly become active, right? And you have to be able to be just as effective on something that was 5 years old as it is today, in the last second as a new block gets mined. And so I think it creates some really interesting engineering trade-offs when you're having to build such a system.
It's always been a big problem. Was there a point in time when it got more real, or you were like, all right, we absolutely need to change something or do something else?
We have this product philosophy where we kind of have an iterative approach. There's this great picture of how to build an MVP. And they were trying to build a car. On the top row, they have sort of a car, and it starts with just one axle, and then maybe you put a body, and then eventually put a steering wheel. And in the bottom, you have a skateboard, then a scooter, then a motorbike.
Something that needs to work at every stage.
Yeah, exactly, right? And that's kind of what I remind our team, which is can we build a skateboard? And what you learn is sometimes that's all you need. You save a bunch of time building a car. And sometimes you realize that, okay, here's what I want my car to look like because of everything I learned when I rode my skateboard. I actually really want my car to have heated seats, right? Something you may not have realized when you first built the car. So we took that iterative approach. So we started super manual when we first started, and then we realized that we had to scale this up. We had to build a product, right? It just wasn't a question we could answer manually. We had to actually build a product around it. And so at TRM, what we've found helpful is kind of three things. One is sort of start with a really small, talented team. Give them a really clear mandate of working backwards from the customer. And third, start with first principles. And I think the second piece around working backwards from the customer is just so important, because a lot of people, when solving hard problems, fall into the trap of working forward from the technology or working forward from what you knew.
Especially in crypto, where there's a lot of inventing of things from can we build this technically, and then see what happens.
Exactly. And then the other thing is you kind of don't challenge the status quo. So when we approached this problem, we kind of just went back to first principles. We first start with the product requirements. You said, what does the customer want? I don't care what the technology can do or what I know or what I think the technology. Let's start with the customer requirements. So we started with that. And so we kind of really explored the landscape and then kind of came back to say, okay, let's run POCs. The failure mode with POCs is that it's a very complex problem. There are a lot of dimensions, right? You're thinking about not just can you answer the question, but can you answer the question quickly? Can it answer the question at scale? Right? So you might have technologies that can say, I can answer one of those questions at a time from one user. Or we have an online web application with thousands of users. I need to be able to handle concurrency. So we ran all the POCs and we finally ended up with a solution that we shipped. And then we've sort of iterated on since. And what's cool about our process and this sort of journey we went on is we actually ended up pushing the state of the art in the industry. So most of the time, or most of the sort of tools out there will help you only answer the question to say, there exists a path, right? And they'll say, and when you want to ask the question of, show me the evidence, what is the path? Most tools will only show you the shortest path. And what's interesting in our scenario, because our tools are used to gather evidence, is that we actually show you all the paths, right? And you can imagine, when you have 100 billion edges, and then you have these paths that can be n hops long, right? Tens of hops long, you can have trillions of paths. And the ability to surface that to the user quickly is not just a feature, but a necessity. Because when you're going to court and you want to be able to say, I have evidence to put someone in jail, you want to make sure you have the evidence.
It has to be something that the court understands, not just the ends that take our word for it.
Exactly. And so I think what I was proud about the team in that moment was it's kind of like our process of how we solve these kind of hard problems. We work backwards from the customer. We start with an extremely talented team, obviously, and then really being first principles about our decision making. We ended up sort of shipping something that I think is better than the sort of the state of the art in the industry right now. And I'm excited for us to continue kind of pushing that going forward. I think now that we have the system live, the question now is how do you continue scaling it, right? There are more and more blockchain, and then how do you do it at cost? Because anyone can provision a 100 terabyte, 500 terabyte memory cluster, but we're not all OpenAI that can afford to has a deal with the cloud vendor. So we have to kind of figure out our strategy of how to do this. And so that's some of the other interesting optimizations that we're doing, using clever data structures and clever algorithms to kind of not just do this problem can it be done, but then doing it in all the other constraints of cost and performance and freshness and all this other stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. We kind of hand wavy sometimes about margins and software products, but when it's a big enough data thing, this is a relevant part. I guess maybe going back to the iterative approach, what strikes me is that you had to both do the POC. There's two hard problems about already having a lot of data in an existing system, right? You need to figure out how much is enough to put the POCs through their paces. And then you, at some point, have to cut over, which is probably a nightmare. And so, right? How did you think about we're routing data both places, or how these things related to the ongoing product that had to continue routing at the same time?
Great question. For us, we invested pretty early on in a feature flagging system. And I think I would recommend that for most folks. The ability to sort of toggle things on and off dynamically allowed us to kind of make that transition much more easily. And then from a data perspective, the reality is we ended up spending more because we did have to maintain both systems. But when you're operating sort of at scale and you have an enterprise product where customers are relying on you, you don't really have the option of turning things off. The best you can do is sort of make this switch seamless. But that's something we continuously are working on. All our large migrations end up having to cost more money just because we have to run the system in parallel. And what's interesting is a lot of our performance issues only show up at scale.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, when you're figuring out which POC, how much is enough data to give you confidence that it's going to work at productions.
Yeah, and we basically end up having to like do we use sort of our hardest problems. So like if you think about the graph, there are certain
you start with like identifying pathological patterns.
cases, right?
Yeah, okay.
Right. So if you think about like Twitter, right, you might have heard like the Justin Bieber problem, right? Like seeing all the followers and their retweets of Justin Bieber is much harder because it's like a supernode in the graph.
Mm-hmm.
And so you kind of look at some of these supernodes and you say, can I solve the problem around those supernodes?
Yeah.
And then you can kind of prove your worst case, and then you assume the other cases work. Now there's a lot of nuance in between because
you don't want to be in like whack-a-mole where
in that example, you're only solving for the query side, but then in large data systems, you have to think about both the read and the write. So what's your update strategy? Can it handle the update throughputs, both for the supernodes and for the sparse nodes? And then what is your update strategy for those two things? I describe the team as sort of like building a sculpture where it's all about proportion. It's not about having the biggest muscles or like the biggest arms or the biggest legs or the biggest like nose or eyes. It's about like being proportionate.
Yeah.
And I think that's the tricky piece where you're constantly trying to like mold this like sculpture in the best way possible.
Because the number of like truly bizarre signatures in blockchain data is probably kind of remarkable, right?
Yeah.
Like you're like, oh wow. you think you have it balanced and some weird thing comes in, you're like, that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Or like new protocols come out or new assets or just new blockchain technologies come out, right? And they have a lot more throughput, which is exciting, right? So, when we started with Bitcoin, it's a few TPS, and then Ethereum was sort of 12, 15, and now, you have some really high throughput blockchains, what people are calling like sort of high throughput L1s or L2s, where, you're looking at hundreds, thousands of transactions per second, and customers want and demand the same experience. You have to constantly strive to meet that bar.
So I imagine you're watching test nets and kind of having to place bets about where you're spending time, what you want to be ready for.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think we're constantly like monitoring like what assets, what protocols, what chains are coming online. And what's interesting about our space is that oftentimes some of the activity that our customers are interested in are happening at the margins. Most of the time, you're not looking at Coinbase and you're saying, oh, like tell me about Coinbase. Like most of the time, you're looking at like some transaction in like this one part of the graph that sort of has some interesting interactions with a few other parts of the graph. Or you're looking at some asset or protocol that someone that maybe is not as popular that might be exploitable.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that we have this long tail problem, both in terms of like the graph itself within a blockchain, but also across blockchains.
No technology is too niche because it might be the fact that the kind of behavior you're looking for correlates with nicheness in some places.
Right. A lot of like illicit activity may start in these sort of like corners. And so if we're not looking there, we're not able to provide visibility.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I guess stepping back, how you went through the latest update to your graph technology, what do you think about the process? Do you feel like you have learnings about how to approach these problems?
For us, the problem matters almost less than the approach. The approach of how you solve the problem, we call it like the TRM way, is probably the most important thing that we've refined over time. And we spent a lot of time helping build the language around how we describe the way we work. And so, as we build updates to all parts of our stack, and really I think about like the process of invention and innovation is about having a really smart group of people working backwards from your customer and starting with first principles. And I know it sounds maybe almost trite, but it truly, when you apply it in practice, allows you to sort of do things that otherwise, most people would sort of hand wave because they're like, oh, like I've done this in my past and it's never worked. And then, you come back and you're like, well, can you explain, like from first principles, like why wouldn't that work? If I take like 10 bits per second and I say like, okay, we have like, X many megabytes you have to move, and like, why can't that happen? And it might still be true that's not a good option, but at least you come away with a deeper understanding of why, and it allows you to better evaluate your other options.
That does seem like a key insight, that this introspection of the possible is where breakthroughs kind of come from.
Yeah.
That's, if you don't think in that mentality, you're not going to do something that's meaningfully new or advanced.
The last thing I'll say is maybe just creating a room for failure. We have a saying at TRM, which is like, fail fast, but fail different. What we mean by that is like failure is sort of given. And we want to normalize the fact that you may fail. In fact, if you're probably not failing, you're probably not trying hard enough. What we want to encourage people to do is fail quickly. Quickly recognize that something's not working, and then ideally fail differently. I think Michael Seibel said this once, and it really stuck with me. This is during YC, and he said, your goal is to either become a super successful, enduring company, or to find a new way to fail. Mm-hmm. Because his thesis was like, all companies fail for like 3 reasons. Founder breakup, run out of money, and I think there's like one other thing. And he's like, if you win, you'll probably win because of like some unique path that you figured out. And if you fail, you'll probably fail for one of these 3 reasons. And that kind of always stuck with me.
I mean, that resonates very deeply. The worst thing in startups, especially early on, is not failure, it's stasis.
Yeah.
And so if you can't step back and be like, what hypotheses are we running? What are the failure criteria? What are the success criteria? Then you're doomed to do the same thing over and over and over. That is like the worst outcome either way, because you can't course correct, you just get in a rut.
Yeah, I tell the team, don't let inertia guide your decisions. As we've grown as an organization, you have more inertia, right? Sort of like going to physics.
Layering it on.
Yeah, you're just kind of like, you have this sort of thing that's moving, and the mass is growing. You have more customers, your product has more complexity, you have more people, right? Like just this mass is just sort of collecting more and more momentum. And so the ability for people to say, this doesn't make sense, and have the courage and the space and the sort of the psychological safety to go say that, I think is just super, super important. And I think that's probably been the thing that I spend a lot of time on, is creating the environment. Because you can't like force invention.
Yeah.
Right? I can't say like, we're going to discover this way of doing something. You have to create the sort of, maximize the odds for creativity and maximize the odds of sort of inventing and discovering something. And so I think that's probably where I spend a lot of my time.
That was great. Okay, so I guess sort of switching gears, you know, I think you're in like a fairly distinct position in terms of the breadth of things you're able to see across the blockchain crypto landscape. What are you looking at these days technically? Like what's exciting you, or what do you see on the horizon that's particularly interesting?
I'm super excited about stablecoins. As you look at kind of the power to take sort of fiat and put it on internet rails is pretty awesome. And you're seeing that, you obviously have Circle and USDC being very popular, but then you also saw PayPal launch their stablecoin that we're proud to support. And it's just you're going to see more and more of these plays come out. So that's one area I think, and we're going to see a lot more innovation around. The second area that I'm super excited about is identity and bringing identity to crypto. I like to use the word responsible privacy, because it is these ledgers are public and to a large degree transparent. And if you ask most people, you wouldn't want your bank account statement auditable by anyone who has time. You ideally want some responsible privacy. There's some really cool technologies that are being worked on by people way smarter than me when it comes to sort of zero knowledge and how you kind of share just the right amount of information in the right way and then maintain control and custody with the end user. I think that's pretty exciting. And then I think the third part that builds on top of that is when I think about the promise of DeFi and I think about the promise of crypto, a lot of people have come to me and said, like, crypto, it just seems to be used for illicit things. Like, what are all like the positive use cases? When I think about crypto, I don't just think about the sort of this anonymity and hiding and sort of this libertarian view. I kind of think about crypto as optionality. And I think what I'm really excited about in the DeFi space, I think we're going to see in the next couple of years, is more options and more what I would call permissioned options. So when you think about the DeFi world, you're going to see a world where you may have, completely unpermissioned protocols where there's no regulation, there's no kind of controls. It's closer to like this perfect decentralized world that some people may like. And then you're going to have a layer on top of that that's sort of more what I would call permission, where people may have some level of responsible privacy, not perfect privacy. You're going to see a lot more adoption in that space as, larger players get involved and then build experiences for consumers on top of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's a little bit of a intersection between the second and the third where differential privacy allows you to opt in or out of the client's regime you want to be a part of.
That's right.
And some products will be offerable in a compliant way, and that's often better for you as a user even, right?
Yeah.
And some won't be. The advances that we're seeing in cryptography that the entire ecosystem has pushed forward make all these things possible.
There's this analogy with like iPhones and how did the drones come about? And the story with drones is that the drones came about because smartphones came about. Mm-hmm. Right? And what smartphones did is it miniaturized a lot of the sensors that you're using in drones, starting with batteries, then starting with into like sort of these MEMS sensors where you can kind of get accelerometer and gyro and sort of taking these large objects and like making them on a tiny chip and then bringing the cost way down, allowed us to then put that technology into the drone. And now you have this whole drone market. And when I think about zero knowledge, it was like this sort of this interesting area of research mathematically. And with the advent of sort of crypto and cryptographically secure blockchains, it's sort of like accelerating the innovation. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be super interesting to see how those technologies rapidly accelerate and innovation is sort of being pressed because of demand, how that may get applied not just in the blockchain and digital asset space, but in other parts of our life as well. I think that's a pretty interesting dynamic playing out.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting and really interesting to work on.
Yeah.
This has been really fascinating. Thank you so much for spending the time with me.
Yeah, happy to be here, Brett. Thanks for having me.
HiBit is produced by Initialized Capital. Our showrunner is Candy Chang. Our videographer and editor is Kevin Heinz. And I'm Brett Gibson. Thanks for listening.